Welcome to The Rest is Politics Leading with me, Alastair Campbell, and I'm not with Rory right now because he's in Australia. However, he was with me shortly before he left when we sat down for a fascinating interview with Professor Timothy Snyder. So can I start by asking you just a little bit about where you come from, childhood? I was fascinated to read that you have what you describe as parents who were left-wing and not just American left-wing. So what do you mean by that?
Well, America is a beautiful and interesting country, and it's easy inside the country and outside the country to say, oh, look, there are the nice liberal coasts, and then there's the terrible backward red hinterland, the flyover country. But the truth is that it's a very interesting patchwork and layers, and people come to their right wing or left wing or other politics from all kinds of interesting directions. My family on both sides has been in Ohio for going on, well, actually, well over 200 years at this point, and on most sides of my family come from religious dissenters. And I think for that reason have always had a bit of an edge as far as having perspective on the rest of the country, perhaps, and taking part in movements which are now seen as radical or progressive. But yeah, it's right that I was raised in a household in the 1970s, which was left-wing and not just by American standards. That would be accurate. Yeah. Even as a child, I was well aware of the difference.
Where would they see Bernie Sanders on the spectrum?
I think both then and, I mean, we have to sort of remember that my parents are now 50 years older than they were when the story begins, and they're both still living. But both then and now, Bernie Sanders would be a sort of perfectly normal fellow.
In the middle.
Yeah. Reasonable. Yeah.
Yeah. There to the left.
Firmly concluded.
For those who are only listening, Professor Snyder nodded.
Tim, then we move on to the next stage of life. You moved from Ohio. You then went, I think, to Brown, and then you ended up studying in England. You went to Oxford. What's your sense of turning up in Oxford? And I guess you were turning up in Oxford quite an interesting moment. I guess it's we're in this sort of transition moment, fall of the Soviet Union, launch of this new kind of Francis Fukuyama age of America as a superpower, history's ended. Tell us a little bit about both what it felt like coming from the US to Britain, and also what in retrospect that decade meant for you.
Well, first, I want to thank you both for the heroic effort to make my early life interesting. I will try to play along with this as best I can. There is something interesting about that moment, though, which does tie into my life. So, I mean, as an American, I had a very fortunate life. Not everything went well, but most things did. And I was able to go off to Brown, which had no particularly well-organized curriculum, and then went off to Oxford, which pretended to have an organized curriculum, but which in fact was sort of push you towards the library anarchy, essentially. And that suited me incredibly well. My personality type was very much that if there weren't rules, then I worked harder. And that, of course, at the time was consistent with a worldview that, not that this was my politics, but I mean, I did have that feeling in life, early in life, like when I won the scholarship, I got to go to Oxford, that things just were working out for me. It was possible then to go along with the idea that, gosh, when that Berlin Wall fell, when communism came to an end, then all the barriers were gone and everything would just kind of sort itself out. Right? Like that kind of intuition, that Anglo-Saxon intuition, which worked well with Thatcherite or Reaganite politics, and which was, of course, I think, completely mistaken. But that like in that sense, like I was very happy. I mean, I was incredibly lucky to be in Oxford. I could study with Tim Garton-Ash. I could study with other people at St. Antony's and elsewhere. And because Oxford had no curriculum to speak of, I could just go to archives and learn languages and make friends. So I spent the first half of the 1990s largely in Eastern Europe doing those things in the archives, making friends, learning languages. And so I did have the deep experience of folks saying that, gosh, if we just get the economics right, everything else will fall into place. And being there at the time and thinking, that doesn't seem quite right. The privatization isn't really working. People are being scammed. Or in Russia, a small group of people are taking all the natural resources. This isn't going to lead necessarily to democracy. Not that I'd thought it all through at the time, but you're right that there was a sense in which, like, you could think things are just now going to work out. And I think that kind of laziness in political thought in the 90s has a lot to do with where we are now.
Sorry, it's sort of spoiler alert. Professor Snyder had an office right opposite me at Yale, although neither of us are there enough to see much of each other. But anyway, we had a good cup of coffee a few weeks ago. And I was just reading a book by one of our colleagues called The Deluge, Adam Tooze, or former colleagues, where he tries to suggest that there's a similar moment before the Second World War, where after the First World War, a kind of idea of a possible liberal global order emerges, which can be made to sound a little bit like your story of the 1990s, where there's global free trade, where there's the rise of liberal democracies, where there's the sort of US domination, and where people like Trotsky and Hitler feel under quite a lot of threat and feel that the world may be going in a certain direction. Do you see those echoes, or do you sort of differ? I mean, I'm just sort of interested in this possibility that history has these moments of maybe before the First World War, too, moments of sort of great sort of apparent complacency and peace that then give way to great conflict.
Yeah, I think it's very hard for us to avoid the sense that somehow everything is coming together and that conflicts can be avoided. And, one of the things that I try to make the case for in the book, in On Freedom, is that the conflicts are real because that's just the kind of creatures we are. Like, even if we only talk about the good things are in conflict with one another. So there just can't be a point, whether it's capitalist or communist, where all the conflicts somehow work themselves out. And if we believe that we're in such a point, then we need to check ourselves, because that's got to be wrong. So what, like, the moment of dialectical trickery of the 1990s was that folks went from thinking, well, one version of economic determinism is correct, to thinking another version of economic determinism is correct. Whereas what we needed to throw out was the economic determinism. Adam Tooze is a wonderful historian, and I think he's certainly onto something. For me, it's that I'm more comfortable with the moment before the First World War for this comparison, where you really did have something that looked like a globalization. The surface of the earth was literally, with the canals and such, was literally being made smaller. The telegraph was like the social media of today. The press media was probably better than the media of today in many ways. And that moment where it just seemed like things could only get better, at least from a European perspective, right? And war was something of the past, which means it was only fought in the colonies, to be fair. But that moment feels more like the 1990s to me. But whatever moment one chooses, I think you're right to put your finger on this phenomenon, which is that moment when you think that history is on your side is when you really have to watch out.
Tim, what was it that made you choose kind of Eastern Europe as the place that you found most interesting, most fascinating, and where you became kind of expert?
So I grew up in the Cold War, and for me, the Cold War meant Russia, the Soviet Union. And I first started studying nuclear arms and conventional arms, and thought I was going to be an arms control negotiator. And then I switched from there to something that people knew less about, which was Eastern Europe rather than the Soviet Union. And I switched a bit from arms control by way of economics, which I studied for a while, to history, and the history of politics, and then the history of ideas, because I thought that there was something more interesting going on. And it was a very naive, but not wrong. It was a very naive impulse that the end of one thing wasn't just going to be more of the same of our thing, but that those Czechs and those Poles and those Bulgarians and those Ukrainians might have something from which we could learn, and that the history of Jewish life, which is so important, could only really be understood in those places where Jews lived before the Holocaust. That was kind of a second level of this insight. And so, like, that was the first thing. And then the second thing which drew me in was what we already talked about, was this rapid, unpredictable change, which we wanted to kind of gather in under various headings like transition or market, but which in fact was humanly unbelievably interesting. And like, whether people were 20 in 1989 or 30 or 10 makes such a huge difference. And watching people's relationships and their families and their, when they have children and why, all of that stuff was just wonderfully interesting. And then the thing which was addictive, and now I'm going to geek out on you incredibly, were the archives. That you could go into these archives if you knew the languages, and you could read documents which either nobody had ever seen, or which people like you hadn't been allowed to see. And you could come to entirely new conclusions about familiar subjects. You could find subjects that hadn't been covered before. So all of that. And then by the time I started writing books like Bloodlands or Black Earth, I was coming to the conclusion, this is kind of a sort of second tier, I was coming to the conclusion that the things we thought we understood about the world, like the Second War, like the Holocaust, we didn't really understand because we hadn't got the East European part right. And so that's kind of pushes me towards mid-career.
So Tim, let's just step on that for a second. What is it that we had not understood about the Second World War and the Holocaust? Give us a sense of what you discovered in the course of that book.
Well, they're very elementary things. The Second World War was primarily about Eastern Europe, which is not something that Americans or British people or the French generally would accept. It's not the way we think about it. The Cold War, the Iron Curtain, cut us off from where the most significant battles of the Second World War took place. It cut us off from the territories that Hitler was most interested in, precisely above all, Ukraine. And the Americans are very significant because economically, and especially in the Pacific, militarily, the British are very significant because if the British don't stay in the war, then it's a very different war and somebody else wins. But the terrains where civilians are killed are in Eastern Europe, almost, the huge majority. And the Holocaust is largely a crime committed against people who live in Eastern Europe. So the Polish Jews, Soviet Jews are overwhelmingly the majority if you take them together. And then the next big group are the Hungarian Jews. And of course, it affects Italian and Czech and French Jews as well. But in smaller numbers, the essence of the Holocaust are killing facilities and death pits, which are not very far away from where the Jews actually lived most of the time. And that groundedness of the Holocaust, I think, is something which so what we miss about the war is that Hitler's main objective was Ukraine. What we miss about the Holocaust is that it took place where the Jews lived, and that it was much more intimate and much closer, and that the mysteries about it are not the mysteries we think. It's not the mystery of mechanization or abstraction or distance or how did people not know. Those are fake questions. The real questions are, how do people kill people they're very close to? What are the motivations for that? How do you move from very brutal face-to-face kinds of killings to slightly more mechanized forms of killings? Those are the real questions. And we were kind of going down the wrong road. When the real questions about the Holocaust have to do with Germans and then people alongside Germans killing people at very close quarters in very large numbers. I think like the way we talked about, even Auschwitz, I had along with the late, great Bob Silvers, the editor of the New York Review of Books, I wanted to title an article saying Auschwitz was a euphemism, and he stopped me from doing that. And I think he was right to stop me. But the point that I was trying to make was that the image of Auschwitz that we have, like that there was only one place, Auschwitz, and that somehow it was like above the earth or below the earth, but not quite of the earth, and not very many collaborators were there. And that it was somehow a factory, we use these metaphors, somehow a factory or a machine, that all of that was clouding us from a much darker reality, which you get to when you read the sources from Belarus or from Poland or from Ukraine.
On this question of you inside the archives, Rory and I fancy ourselves as linguists because I speak 3 languages and Rory speaks several, albeit
really badly. Really badly.
But, yeah. So when you're in these archives, are you reading in all these languages and understanding? Did that not take you years to learn them?
First of all, I want to just say that speaking languages badly is a mark of a courageous person. If you're willing to speak languages badly, you'll get to places and make friends you won't otherwise make. Especially if you speak an imperial language like we do, right? Like the ability to speak languages badly is not something that all the British and all the Americans have ever been able to do. So good for Rory is what I'm saying.
But you speak 5 fluently.
I speak some. I speak some badly too, though. Like I speak some quite well, and I speak some quite badly. And sometimes, my Ukrainian is not great, but I've been speaking a lot of Ukrainian lately because there's been a reason to do it.
But you could read these archives in all these different languages, and
yeah. But it was so. My languages, except for I have a little bit of Hebrew, but except for that, my languages are all. They're Romance, Germanic, or Slavic, so 3 language families. And I was free in the early 90s. I didn't know how hard Polish would be, but I threw myself into it, and I had patient friends, and the internet wasn't there, so I could choose not to be touched by English. I learned Polish and French really well for the dissertation. I learned German pretty well because I had to be in Austria to do work as well. And then on that basis, I learned the other ones. But I had a lot of time. I refused to speak English with other people, which really helps. I just declined to speak English for about 5 years, and except obviously with my family and so on. But in Europe, I wouldn't speak English, and that was part of it. And I read a lot, and that was part of it. And it was also just very exciting.
Did you ever think of going into diplomacy? You mentioned possibly being an arms control negotiator. Have you ever thought about going into diplomacy or politics rather than academia and history?
Yes, but those are probably not wise thoughts. When I went to Oxford, you're still like pursuing this like make Tim Snyder interesting line, which I don't think your viewers are going to reward you for. But when I went off to Oxford, I very much had the kind of all-purpose intellectual in mind. Like I could be a scholar, I could be a journalist. I mean, like I could be an activist, I could travel, I could write about it. So as a kid in the 80s. I read Tim Garton-Ash in the New York Review. I also read other people in the New York Review, but that was kind of my model. Like you could write a big thick book in the background, right? But you could also go places and know people and write about things, catch history as it was happening. That was my model. And I did actually take the force, but I did think about being a diplomat, like because there were people I admired, like George Kennan, or there was Thomas W. Simons Jr., who was a fantastic historian, who was also an American diplomat, who was quite high-ranking and important at the end of the Cold War, and who happened to teach me at Brown. So I had this notion you kind of put all these things together, and probably better people than me could. And I did actually take the American Foreign Service exam when I was in college, and I have sort of committed journalism from time to time as well. But I think I'm really better as a historian, or just better as someone who like says what he thinks than trying to be a diplomat. And this was something which going back to Oxford, this was a conversation which Tim Garton-Ash and I actually had, where he said, Tim, I believe you have a uniquely scholarly talent, which it took a moment for the penny to drop there as to what he actually meant. but it did come home.
I'd like to move on. I mean, you made an observation about killing at close quarters, and I've just been reading Chris Browning's book about Reserve Police Battalion 101, and this sort of granular accounts of these individual men. And what did you conclude about killing at close quarters, and how did that help you understand some of what's happening around us today?
Well, one thing, and this seems very simple, but it reminds us that war is about conquering territory, and that the Germans who were going through Poland were on their way to Ukraine and the Caucasus and Western Russia because they were after particular resources and particular territory, and that they wouldn't have been there to kill those Jews if they hadn't conquered that territory. And I think the way that we think about war very often today is incredibly abstract. And I'm struck often, even 2.5 years into the war in Ukraine, where the people who are supposedly the experts on the question don't know where the rivers are, and don't know what the steppe is, and don't know what the ports of the Black Sea were, and don't know about the history of the 2,500 years of history of war for that territory. So the face-to-face killing reminds you that this war happened in a place. And to put that more positively, second thing, it reminds you that Jews have a history. If you're thinking about the Holocaust, like a deep, complicated, interesting history of long settlement of large numbers of people in precisely these lands. I mean, if you think about Jewish history as just a diaspora, then you can kind of bracket that whole bit. But that whole bit is like, that's what most of what we know about most of the Jews who have ever lived is that. And so when you look at the history of killing face to face, because this is what happens like with the factory metaphor, is that if it's a factory, then they're not really people, and you don't have to, that's why I just don't like these metaphors. Whereas if you think about the killing of it, like if you, and I searched hard for these, like if you have the records of people that they left behind right up to the moment of their death, then you see something about how they lived and what their connections were and what their children's names were and things like this. And so the face-to-face killing reminds you that it was a person, and it reminds you that there was a history. There's that. And then as far as perpetration, it makes us, I think it helps us to see how easy it is to slip into various things, like events like the German soldiers who were murdering thousands, or the German SS men or policemen who were killing tens of thousands of people at Kamianets-Podilsky or Babi Yar or whatever. They didn't know they were they knew what they were doing was extraordinary, but they didn't know they were taking part in something that would later be called a genocide or later be called the Holocaust or the Shoah. Just like people who do terrible things now don't necessarily see the whole picture, right? The things that matter, sure, ideological motivation matters, but also conformism and like the terrible human inability not to do the thing that guy next to you is doing. These like incredibly banal things. Like once and Chris Browning is very good on this, once you know that Germans were not actually punished, they weren't punished if they chose not to shoot.
But there's incredible moment in the Chris Browning book where one of the police officers who doesn't participate, two things are going on. Firstly, you get his colleagues sort of talking sight contempt of him, saying, well, all very well for him, he got to get on his moral high horse and, we had to go and do the business. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And then him saying slightly apologetically, well, yes, it's true. I didn't kill people on that occasion, but then I was a little bit older and I had Jewish friends and I had a business to go back to in Hamburg. And so, as you say, the conformism was so deep that they were almost using the tone of voice that my colleagues who are whips in Parliament use about, making you vote for something you're not very keen to vote for, and explaining why you don't go along with the team, and feeling slightly apologetic about not doing it.
I mean, we have this incredible human double capacity to shift to an incredibly new sort of behavior and then to make it normal. And I think we have to be aware of that. So, I mean, Browning took a special case, like a very good case, because it involved a lot of middle-aged. I read the book longer ago than you, but if I remember correctly, it involved a lot of middle-aged folks. Yep. And I think he deliberately picked a unit which was less ideologically prepared than other units were, right? So that he'd have kind of a cleaner case for his argument. But even, but the point is that people can shift to a very different reality and make something else normal. And while it's normal, then those normal human sentiments like kick in. Like, I shouldn't step down from killing these Jews because then the other guys have to do more of it, right? Which would be applicable to, like, if you were chopping down trees or mopping the floor or something, but somehow you're able to take that normal human sentiment and apply it to this, what would seem like an incredibly abnormal situation. We have to remember that we're able to do that, because if we don't remember able to do that, we can't say like, oh, this thing that seems normal to me right now, maybe it's actually radically abnormal. And 3 years ago, I would have seen it that way. And 3 years from now, I'm going to see it that way.
We obviously want to come back to Russia and Ukraine, but just given that you've mentioned the Holocaust, are you worried that we're losing sight of the significance of the Holocaust? And is that partly explaining the difficulties that lots of people are having in debating what's happening in the Middle East now?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I have things to say about the Holocaust in the present, but I guess I would want to draw you out on the specific connection you want to make about the Middle East.
Well, if I was an Israeli, I would think that one of the reasons that there appears to be, they would say, less sympathy for what they're doing at the moment is because current younger generations have no real sense of just how awful the Holocaust was and what it means to Jewish people.
So, yeah, I mean, there are some Israelis who would argue it that way, and there's some Israelis who would argue it a different way. Who would argue that if you deeply understood the Holocaust, that means that you wouldn't think of destroying all the universities in Gaza. I want to agree with the underlying sentiment, though, which is that I do think that there is right now, the year 2024, we are in a moment of worsening global anti-Semitism that one feels from various sides, and not at all just in the Middle East, also in the United States and in Europe. And that it's not like people on the right will say, well, it's just on the left, and people on the left will say it's just on the right. I think it kind of escapes those categories. I think there is a global problem. I don't think it's not the first point I would make about the Gaza war, but you do feel it in discussions about the Gaza war. You do sense it, and even in discussions about Ukraine. You like the way that Trump, for example, this is an indirect example, but I think an important one, the way that Trump talks about Zelensky as anti-Semitic, 100% anti-Semitic. He talks about Zelensky as a war profiteer, whereas Zelensky is in fact a physically courageous person. But because he's a Jew, he can't be a physically courageous person. He has to be a war profiteer. It can't really be a war. It has to be a scam. In the book that I wrote about the Holocaust, which is called Black Earth, I made a revisionist argument, not in the sense of Holocaust revisionism, but I made a different kind of causal argument. And I think in addition to the global anti-Semitism, which is what I called it, like Hitler had a very specific view of Jews, there were two other factors which mattered a lot. One was the destruction of states, and the other was a sense of ecological catastrophe. And those two factors, I think, were causally necessary for the Holocaust. The Germans could only do what they did in the political social spaces created when they destroyed states. And this goes back to Eastern Europe and territory. They didn't occupy Poland and the Soviet Union the way that they occupied France, for example. They deliberately destroyed institutions. They took citizenship away. They created, in that way, a completely new set of social dynamics, which enabled the Holocaust. And then the sense of ecological catastrophe, that we're running out of everything. Everyone's going to go hungry, and therefore it's morally right for one race to take from other races, which hooks back to the anti-Semitism, because Hitler says that the Jews try to teach us things like they teach us Christianity, they teach us socialism, they teach us the rule of law, they teach us constitutionalism, they teach us Marxism. All the stuff that Jews teach us is basically the same. It's basically about trying to tell us that there's something besides a struggle of race against race. And that's why we have to remove the Jews, because we have to have a race against race. And so what ecological catastrophe, or the sense of it, does to politics is also a lesson, I believe, a forgotten lesson of the Holocaust, and one which is quite relevant to the 2020s.
That's absolutely right, what you said. I mean, I think we feel it all the time, that anti-Semitism is on the rise. And of course, we also feel, or at least I feel in Britain, that anti-Muslim sentiment's on the rise, that there's a lot of people who are now settling into very unpleasant tropes and generalizations about Muslims, and seem to be willing to describe Muslims in a very dismissive, odd, generalizing way. I mean, and maybe that's taking you out of your area of expertise, but I mean, is that a new phenomenon, or is that something that, in your study of the 20th century, you can see also the origins of this kind of anti-Muslim sentiment?
You're right, Rory. That's not something that I've studied or I feel particularly expert in, but I certainly agree with the premise. And I think it's very important to recognize that just because somebody's an anti-Semite doesn't mean they're not anti-Muslim, which is Trump's case, right? You can very easily be both. And the fact that someone's against Muslims doesn't mean they're a friend to the Jews, or vice versa, for that matter.
Just talk us through how the Soviet Union morphed into the Russia that we have today, and which form of dictatorship you think history will be kinder to.
That's a really interesting question, because it is the case that in many ways, the right, I think it's a fascist country now, but putting the label aside, I think the Russian regime, on a lot of measures that folks would agree to now, is more repressive than late Gorbachev, and probably even than Brezhnev. So it's an interesting thought, especially when you start thinking about durability, because the whole Soviet Union only lasted for 69 years, whereas Putin has been in power now, in one way or another, for what we've got of the 21st century. Yeah. So he's getting to the point. Like, give him if he does, I don't think he will, but if he gets through one more presidential term, he's been in power for half as long as the Soviet Union even existed, which is, kind of remarkable. I think they'll be remembered as very different systems. And that's the tricky part. And again, kind of the dialectical part, because there are ways in which the Soviet Union enabled Russia of today, like dialectical ways. Like if you have central planning, and you have it's relatively easy for the few valuable enterprises to end up in the hands of a few people. And so in an odd way, state planning gets you to monopoly, which is something that somebody like Hayek wouldn't have been too surprised by. And there's a funny way in which the Marxist project pointing towards the future actually led to the Putin project of pointing towards the past, which is that when you say everything's in the future and you fail, you're setting yourself up for nostalgia. And so Brezhnev was already nostalgia for the Second World War, and Putin just takes that a step further, and now it's nostalgia for the Second World War, plus the 18th century, plus the 10th century. So there are ways that one led to the other, but they are very different kinds of systems. The Soviet Union at least always pretended that it was about an idea, and it always pretended that there was truth and that it was telling the truth. Whereas Russia succeeds, insofar as it succeeds, by denying that there's a reason to anything, denying that there's any sort of truth, which is a very comfortable reality for the present Russian system, which is a kind of fascist oligarchy. And it's why Russia and Russian methods are so tempting and attractive for folks beyond Russia who are aiming for similar things.
Tim, one of the mysteries is, on the one hand, obviously, the Russian population is, by global standards, highly educated, highly informed. and will be conscious of many of the problems of Putin's regime. And yet at the same time, many, many Russians will buy into a very nationalist view, and Putin's popularity is sort of surprisingly high, given the nature of the regime. And we can discuss how popular or how unpopular, but it's still surprisingly high. So, he's more popular than the Iranian regime is with its people, etc. Right? So what's going on here that these highly educated, thoughtful Russians can have, or some of them at least, can have a sort of implicit sympathy for Putin, a skepticism about Ukraine's claims? Over to you.
So I'm going to give the easy answer and the hard answer. The easy answer is that there has been a sifting that many of the most critical Russians are, of course, now in Riga or Vilnius. They're scattered. They're not necessarily in Russia. But the hard answer, because I don't want to dodge it, has to go something like this. We were talking earlier about what went wrong in the 90s, which could be characterized as a politics of no alternatives, to coin a phrase. That the thing that we have is the only real thing. That's Putin. That's Putin. It's just a darker version. What Putin says is that what Russia has is what everybody has. England is no different. America is no different. If you believe that it's any different, that's because you're a gullible fool. And that, of course, is an attractive line of argument, because you don't want to think you're living in a worse country. You'd rather think, well, the English pretend, but they're just hypocrites. And of course, England and America, and you could use any example for this, we generate enough stuff for their media that it's easy for them to portray us as basically corrupt and our democracies as basically a joke and so on, which is what their media does. And this is important. Their media, and this goes again back to the question about the difference between Russia and the Soviet Union, that in the Soviet Union, the idea was propaganda is about how the state is good. And in Russia, propaganda is about how everybody else's state is bad. They don't have domestic news coverage at all. It's all about how things are terrible in London, things are terrible in Nevada. That's it. Things are terrible in Paris. Today, they're terrible in Italy. That's it. And just to finish the thought, the way that this works psychologically is that it becomes it does speak to a certain kind of nationalism. Because if everything is terrible, if it's terrible everywhere, what's good about the Russians is that at least we're honest about it, right? At least we are the only ones who say we're terrible. The rest of you are a bunch of hypocrites.
And there's a sort of history, isn't there? Because there was, during the Soviet Union period, a very strong move by the left to point to real crimes, the British Empire or the oppression of African Americans in the United States, as kind of big symbolic ways of saying these capitalist democracies are hypocritical. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, really appealed to many people on the left within our own countries. So there's some of that is there in the past. But there's been added to this something that I'm increasingly picking up on in Europe, which is a sort of argument of Russian spiritual superiority, that we're all a bunch of kind of decadent materialists, mm-hmm. and that they represent the last hope of profound, serious, spiritual Western civilization.
Yeah, I think that argument kind of runs two different totalitarian ways, and you can find them both in Russia. You can find them coexisting, and you can find them overlapping. The one is the we have a big soul version. So we have a big soul, and you have smaller souls. And the big soul version, you can't possibly understand our depths, from the narrow perspectives of your tiny Western souls. The big soul version also kind of works with communism, because communism says Marxism says there is actually a single human nature, and the problem is that it's been corrupted by, and this is where it is kind of a religious line of thinking, it's been corrupted by something which happens to be private property. And so if you can remove this earthly corruption, we'll all get back to having our big soul, or as Marx and Engels said, our species essence. So the big soul thing can actually work with communism. It can also work with flat out religion or right-wing views. It can work with fascism. So there are Russian fascists like Ivan Ilyin, who Putin has cited many, many, many times and continues to cite, who say that the world it's no longer a Marxist view, it's a fascist view. The world is fragmented, it's beaten up. Everybody in the West just picks up the pieces. We're concerned with these things we call facts, but facts don't matter. The only thing which matters, we're concerned with individual values, they don't matter. The only thing which matters is wholeness. and Russia is the only hope for wholeness. And on this line of reasoning, Russia may not have a big soul now, but it might in the future. And Russia's the only hope. And since Russia's the only hope, anything that Russia does now doesn't matter. Russia can't do wrong because the wrong that it's doing is just in this superficial factual world or the superficial world of values like human rights. And none of that stuff matters. All that matters is the fundamental wholeness. So the big soul argument can work both from a fascist position and a communist position. But then there's also the no soul argument. The no soul argument goes like this. We know that we're all complete nihilists. And you guys are complete nihilists too, but we're superior to you because we're honest about the fact that we are complete nihilists. And so it's like, it's one soul or no soul. And you can see Putin doing both of those. Like Tuesdays and Thursdays, it's big soul. And Monday, Wednesdays, Fridays, it's no soul. And the weekends he has off.
Tim, what does Russia winning this war look like? What does Ukraine winning this war look like? And why is it so important to the world that it's the latter that prevails?
I mean, I was speaking in a slightly jovial fashion just then, but it's actually quite a serious point. The point about morality, that the idea that you really can do anything is evident in this war in Ukraine. That you can do everything because you're Russian is extraordinarily evident in the way that they treat Ukrainian people and Ukrainian children and Ukrainian elites, Ukrainian cities. And that, I think, is at stake. Like the idea that there are, in fact, values besides your sense that you're special. Because if it's all about your sense that you're special, it's really hard to hold up anything like constitutionalism, let alone an international legal order. So that notion that everything is permitted, either because God is dead or because I am God, like one or the other. But that notion is kind of what's at stake, because democracy, it's a word we toss around and we kind of empty it of value by using it so much and so loosely. But democracy really does depend on the idea that there are people and the people should rule, and that there's something good about people which will allow them to rule. And this war is directly against a democracy, but it's also against democracy in that moral sense. And if we let the Ukrainians lose, it's pretty hard to imagine what better case we're going to have for supporting a democracy, and what better allies we're going to have who are willing to take risks for it. So there is that deep, hard to define moral stake, I think. And then geopolitically, there is the basic post-war order that countries aren't supposed to invade other countries and claim they don't exist and take their territory. That was the basic post-colonial way we were supposed to be thinking about legal order. Russia is challenging that. Third, there's China, which everyone, or most everyone, thought was the real issue. And if Russia's allowed to prevail in Ukraine, then it's hard to see what's going to prevent the Chinese from being more adventurous. My own view is that the Ukrainians are now deterring the Chinese in a way that we can't, because anything we do to deter China can be read as provocative. But Ukraine defeating Russia is not a provocation to China. It just shows that offensive operations are difficult. So that's kind of a special opportunity that we have. And then beyond that, there's nuclear proliferation, which I worry about a lot, because Russia, it's pretty unique, and this goes back to the nihilism point, to try to win a war by brandishing your nuclear weapons, which is what Russia has done. It's been not using them, but brandishing them. And if you can win a war by brandishing nuclear weapons, that means that everybody has to build them either to brandish or to defend against the brandishing. So there are multiple European and Asian countries which will go nuclear in the next decade if Russia wins this war, in my view. And that makes nuclear war more likely.
And just the first part of my question, what does Russia winning look like and what does Ukraine winning look like? How does the war end either way?
Somebody wins. Somebody wins and somebody loses, which doesn't mean they'll acknowledge it, but somebody wins when the other side political order breaks. In Russia, there are three ways this can happen. Putin loses power, Putin dies, or Putin changes the subject, and which he's very capable of doing. I mean, Ukraine matters to them hugely right now, but the moment that there's another coup attempt or something else happens, then they'll all be thinking about Russia, just like they did in summer of 2023. It's very possible for them to change the subject. We just have to make it. We have to make the subject change. So I can't tell you like what it looks like operationally, but what I can tell you is that in Russia, it feels like someone has to change the subject because Russian troops are more necessary somewhere else than in Ukraine right now. And in Ukraine, it looks like NATO membership, EU membership, the sense that the future has been restored and that we can claim, if not literally, we're claiming politically, morally, with lots of support at our back, all of our territory.
Tim, I'm now going to get into territory that's going to get us all in trouble and make it sound like I'm obsessed, but it does make me sort of think about the Middle East and what the similarities and differences are here, because I guess a critic of what's happening in the Middle East might say that there are some similar dynamics at play, that there is a sense that one nation has a very, very unique right, and that either through some sort of great soul argument or some sense of its own legitimacy, ideas of proportionality and neighbors are pushed aside. And I also think that there's maybe if I move away from the Middle East, because it's maybe too sensitive to drag you into, but I mean, maybe if you looked at Myanmar and elsewhere, the question is not just a question of what democracy means in terms of the protection of minority rights, but the connection to this idea of a global order and borders, that it is partly about a sense that Russia-Ukraine sometimes seems to be symptom of a broader problem of us giving up on ideas of international law, giving up on ideas of humanitarian intervention, giving up on ideas of a US-led order, that it does feel like we're entering a culture of impunity in which increasingly nations are simply asserting they have the right to do almost anything, provided it's in their own, they feel it's in their national interest to do it.
Yes. First of all, I think it's perfectly okay to talk about the Middle East, and I don't want to be shy about it. I'm not expert on it, but I think we are watching an entirely unnecessary a tragedy unfold before our eyes in the Middle East. And I'm happy to talk about it, though I'm not expert. So feel free to follow up on that question. And just to make sure I don't dodge anything which is provocative, it's clearly the case that an American conservative Christian conception of Israel as a place which is unlike other places, inhabited by people whose fate is somehow connected to the world becoming whole in some way. It's clearly the case that that view of Israel has something to do with the kind of place that Israel is now and the kinds of things that Israel is doing now, and the difficulty that the United States has in restraining it. Or that view has something to do with the difficulty that even well-meaning Americans have in seeing Israel as a country like other countries and analyzing Israel with the same tools that we would use to analyze other countries. And I'm happy to go further with that. But sorry, the general point, I just think you're absolutely right, and it's very brilliantly put. The Ukrainians, who in general are very hesitant about, to say the least, about citing Russian literature, the way that many of them characterize Russian culture is crime without punishment. So impunity, precisely that. And once you have crime without punishment, crime starts to seem like the point in itself. It like you're in a different moral world. There's a different moral geometry where you show off by your ability to commit crimes, which of course in political terms blends back into fascism with Carl Schmitt and his definition of the sovereign as the person who can make an exception. So Putin is saying, I'm going to make an exception over and over and over again until everyone realizes that your rules don't really mean anything. And of course, it's not only Putin, as you say, but the war in Ukraine to me is a bit special because it is a place where there's an unusual amount of moral clarity and where I think we do have the ability to make a difference. And those two things don't always hold.
Tim, crime without punishment, the image that popped into my head was Donald Trump. And I just wondered, in relation to Ukraine, you've sort of alluded to this already in citing Trump's comments about Zelensky, but also in relation to the Middle East and in relation to the issues that you've written about, both on tyranny and also your latest book on freedom. How big a danger is it if Trump gets back? And if he does get back, is that not the ultimate crime without punishment?
I can't disagree with the beautiful formulation of that question. I was thinking about, I wrote a little column in my Substack the other day about Georgia, which is gotten to this very weird position where like the normal voter suppressors are may have to stifle the Trumpist voter suppressors because the Trumpist voter suppressors are so radical that it discredits the normal kind of voter suppression.
Yeah.
So I was thinking about Georgia, which is like a key American state in this election, obviously. And then I realized, like Trump called up Georgia and asked them to find 12,000 votes. Like he literally made a phone call. Like it's like Hollywood, it's like the kind of crime that you almost have to be wearing a black hat to commit, right? And have a camera in front of you. You call somebody up and literally say, find 12,000 votes so I can win the election. And I was reading this thinking, my God, the man has still not been prosecuted for this. Like, he has still not been prosecuted for this. And it really calls into question what kind of country I live in. And I think the kind of country I live in is between these two things. Like, it's not, and this is kind of like, in some deep sense, what's at stake with Trump, because we're obviously not a rule of law state in the way that we would like to be, because there are countries, and they're not perfect countries, but there are countries like Italy and France and so on, where at least people do get prosecuted having been head of government or head of state. Like, it does happen, but we're not them. We're clearly not them, but we're also not quite Russia. Like, we do have, or we're not Hungary. We do have prosecutors at work. It's just somehow in 4 years, we haven't actually been able to bring a criminal case. So it's like we're hovering in between. And as with the war in Ukraine, so with the election of Trump, if Trump can come to power, I'm going to use that term, because there are scenarios in which he comes to power where I don't think he actually wins.
Yeah.
But if Trump can come to power, that's going to be really rough on the rule of law. Not only because he is, as you say, someone who has obviously committed lots of crimes for which other people would already have been committed. Like, if your local city councilman called up and said, find me 200 votes, like, that person would be in
They're
prison.
gone. They're in jail.
Yeah. But also because it's not just the past, it's the future that he's promising. He's promising to use the law to punish his political opponents. And he's also promising to fire the 40,000 or so top civil servants whose job has been to execute the law, and to replace them with cronies who will presumably just kind of do what he says. So, I mean, that's just one dimension of how bad it will be, is that it is really about the rule of law in every possible way.
And Ukraine, if Trump wins?
I think Ukrainians keep fighting. I mean, I'm kind of hoping that some smart person gets NATO enlargement. I shouldn't say enlargement, I don't like that term, because it's not about NATO, it's about Ukraine. But I'm hopeful that some smart person gets the ball rolling on Ukrainian membership in NATO before Trump wins, because I think the Europeans need a framework and a way to depoliticize assistance for Ukraine. One that, like the British, and that it's bigger than the EU. Well, of course, the EU Commission has been great, but the Ukrainians will have to keep fighting. Because even in like Trump's scenario where he cuts off American aid to Ukraine to force Zelensky to the table with Putin, let's say that even happens and there's a ceasefire, the Russians just then invade again 6 weeks or 6 months later. Yeah. So the Ukrainians don't have any choice. They're going to be fighting one way or another. And so the question is whether, like, the Canadians, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Europeans can get themselves together to help in some way. I don't think he's going to win, but he could. And I think Europeans, the British, have to have some kind of plan B, even if it's not a great plan B for this, rather than saying like, oh, well, if Trump wins, we're just going to throw up our hands. Yeah. That's what the Russians are counting on, by the way.
Can I come in with an old chestnut? But tell us what people miss, commentators and international observers, about why people vote for Trump. I mean, you'll be aware of the sort of cliches that we might have in the United Kingdom for why people vote for Trump. What do you think we might be getting wrong in Britain in our perception of that? And what might even the New York Times not quite get about why people vote for Trump?
The stuff that people miss isn't necessarily the interesting stuff. Like, part of the problem is that, like, we want these problems to be interesting, and they're not always interesting. So one of the things in the US is that we have a two-party system. And of the two parties, the Republicans are the ones that's more like a club or a clan. And the Democrats are more like, they're more like a circus or a sporting event or something. Like, you can go in and out of it, and there are different parts of it, right? And there are good things to both sides, honestly. Like, when Republicans say they're loyal to their party, I think, okay, like, I get it. Loyalty is a good thing. It's just like, sometimes you have to take other things into account. And so much the reason why people are going to vote for Donald Trump is just that there's an R next to his name on the ballot. And that's an incredibly boring explanation, but I'm afraid it's true. There are just a lot of folks in America who can't really believe that if the candidate's a Republican, he could be a bad guy who could destroy the system. And that's too banal to report about, but I think that's a big part of it. And then there are the historical things which are harder to explain, I think, for journalists, which many journalists understand very well, but they can't quite get it into a column, like the legacy of slavery. That's a hard column to write, but because slavery, therefore voter suppression, because voter suppression mentality that Black votes maybe don't count, because of that mentality, when Trump says he won in 2020, he's triggering a lot of Americans who, although they wouldn't say it out loud, really do think that those Black people in Baltimore or Detroit or Philadelphia or Atlanta cheat or somehow shouldn't get a whole vote. So, like, historical racism And again, like Americans are very good at dodging this and getting around it and superficially not being, but that is a big part of it. And then something that reporters do get, but which I think is really important, is just lack of mobility. That folks, like people not being able to move in the country and socially and change social class the way that they could before is a big part of it, because that opens up the way for the Trumpian nostalgia. Like things were better 2 generations ago than they are now. And then another thing that people I think hesitate to admit is that the guy is really talented, right? Like Mussolini was talented too. Trump is talented. Like it's not our taste necessarily, but like objectively, he is a talented entertainer. Like he is good at what he does. It may not speak to us, but he is good at a thing, right? And I think that's also part of it. Like he goes to his rallies, he makes no sense, he contradicts himself, he lies all the time, blah blah blah. But he does still pack a punch. Not the one he did maybe 8 years ago, but he is still good at what he does, and he's still working hard. He's still working pretty hard to do it, and that's part of it too.
Tim, you're very big, both in your work and in your sense of the world and what's wrong with the world, on the concept of truth and fact and the role of journalism. And you're also, I love that quote you had in one of you, I can't remember which book it was, but you talked about collective memory as a tool of resistance. How important to Trump has the whole post-truth concept been? The fact that he seems to be able to lie and not just get away with it, but have many, many, many people, including media people, believe the lies.
Yeah, or if not exactly believe them as truth, believe that storytelling is the reality. Because there are a lot of other mechanisms that go into this, like people, when they realize he's lied, they think, well, it's okay that he lied because that's what a clever politician does. And then they tell themselves, but actually, I knew he was lying all along, And so it's like people
it's like a sort of American version of what you said earlier about Russians saying that we're hypocrites.
It is.
They all lie, so what's wrong with him lying?
That is it. And that's a way that Trump is a Putinist character. And I think that's the right way to put it, because Putin got there first. But Trump is a Putinist character in that way. He knows that he doesn't have to respect the convention of telling the truth. And that's the difference, because you can have liars who respect the convention. If you catch them in a lie, they say, okay, well, my speechwriter did it or whatever, but you're respecting the convention. He doesn't respect the convention.
No.
And I think liberals, I mean this like small L, enlightenment-oriented people think, well, we're all kind of rational, we're all seeking the truth, and therefore this Trump is some kind of deviation. Whereas in fact, the politics in which we're all kind of rational, all kind of seeking the truth takes a hell of a lot of generational work over and over and over again. And the thing that he's doing, it isn't just some kind of deviation or a failure. It's just a different kind of politics based on a different metaphysic and a different epistemic. And it works, right? Like whether you call it fascism or not, this idea that there isn't really truth, there's just will, there's just emotion. You start by you define truth by defining the enemy, and then you go from there. That works as politics. We know that works as politics.
And how alarmed were you, Tim, when you, in the debate that Trump did with Kamala Harris, how alarmed were you at his refusal to answer twice the question about whether he actually wanted Ukraine to win the current war with Russia?
Well, personally, it didn't make any impression on me because I've long been convinced that he wants Russia to win. So It is just unfortunately the case that Trump believes that dictators should rule the world, and that real power is in the hands of people who make their states and societies weaker at the expense of themselves. And that's Putin, right? Russia is much weaker as a state and a society than it could be because of Putin and his oligarchy and his wars. And Trump thinks that's the way things should be. And therefore, because that's how things should be, Putin should beat Zelensky. The dictatorship should beat the democracy. Democracies are weak. He doesn't like them, right? So unfortunately, it's very alarming, but personally, it wasn't at all surprising to me. I want to signal something else, though. Trump over and over again says, Ukraine is finished, Ukraine is done, it's been obliterated. And I just want to point out that when he does that, again, I think one has to assume that he's intelligent and he usually knows what he's doing. What he's doing is he's setting a marker for later on, because he's saying today Ukraine is obliterated. That's not true, of course. Where the Russians occupy, there have been horrible war crimes, but the country itself is The economy is doing pretty well. They've restored trade in the Black Sea. The cities are people are going to work. It's like it hasn't been destroyed as a country. But when he says Ukraine's been obliterated, what he's doing is setting us up for what happens after his so-called deal with Putin. Mm-hmm. That's what he thinks is going to happen. He thinks, I'm going to give away the store to Putin, then Ukraine's going to be obliterated, but I'm just going to congratulate myself on my great deal, and I'm not going to, and Ukraine was already obliterated, therefore nothing bad can happen to Ukraine. I'm just going to just say that's the way the politics of this is supposed to work in his head.
Tim, last one from me. You've been very patient, but just to return back to the story of the young Tim Snyder in the 90s. One of the big differences between then and now is that we've lost faith in the idea that there is a clear vision of how to create more prosperous, democratic, peaceful societies. I mean, if you think about, we're talking at the moment where there's talk about, regime change in Iran, for example. And maybe in the 90s, we would have had an idea that, okay, you get rid of the Ayatollahs and a liberal democracy emerges. Now we've seen Egypt and Myanmar and Syria and Iraq, and we can think of 30 scenarios which are pretty nasty about what happens when the regime collapses in Iran. And Iranians too maybe sense that, and maybe the Afghans sense this when looking at the Taliban, that there's no longer something available to people when they look at unpleasant regimes, which gives them confidence that there is a clear, well-performing, delivering democratic future which they can easily reach for.
I mean, one thing which is worth noticing is that even though democracy is right now being challenged and overall in decline, there are places which are actually working incredibly well. And those places are not very good at telling their stories, right? Like, where's the powerful story about Norway, or where's the powerful story? I mean, even places that like Poland, which has lots of problems. I mean, but there's still an incredible story about a place like Poland, which didn't used to have good roads and now has good roads. People in Poland now live longer on average, or it's close depending on what you're looking at, but they live as longer than Americans. Like, who would have thought that was going to happen? So there are these good stories, and we're just very poor at telling them. That's the first thing. The second thing is, and this is a point that I try to make in my book and on freedom, that our problem a little bit was like, and it is like the Marxist problem, that when we were pointing to the future, we were just pointing to one future. And that one future had too much to do with determinism. So the invasion of Iraq is, and this is, by the way, I'm not somebody who's changed his mind on this. I was against it at the time for this reason, among others. But the invasion of Iraq was premised on this, that if you just knock over something bad, then deterministically things are going to rise up and create something good. And that just isn't true. And the problem is when you only have one idea of how things work, then, as you say, you get disillusioned, right? You get disillusioned. You go from 1 to 0. And this is the third point. I think to have an idea of the future, and this is how I would kind of characterize the problem, that we don't have an idea of the future. And without an idea of the future, you can't really have a democratic present, because a democratic present depends on negotiating futures. It's all about negotiating futures. The moment it's about negotiating past, you can tell things have gone wrong. We have to know the past so we can get to the future. But when it's all about negotiating the good guys and the bad guys in the past, you've taken a wrong turn. And so we have to have a future to look into, but it has to be a future which is open to multiple things. I think that's what's gone. And of course, some of those things are bad. Global warming, disaster, right? There are bad things that can happen, but there are also good things that can happen. And this is why, this is where I'm trying to land in the book. This is what I'm trying to hit in the book, that that there are actually a whole bunch of futures, and they're not all bad. Some of them are quite good, but we're not going to get there just by thinking that there's only one, or that it's going to be brought to us automatically. But we have to actually start thinking about different combinations of futures and trying to get there. And I think that's doable. I think we're in a cycle which you've described of thinking, well, history's on our side, or the economy's on our side, or our righteousness is on our side. And now we're out of that cycle. So Trump and Putin presents an alternative, which is nothing's actually good. And Putin actually says very sharply, he weaponizes the sentiment that you're talking about. He says, look, it might be bad here, but it's going to be, whatever you try to improve it, it's going to be worse. So if you go on the streets in Syria, it's going to be worse. If you go on the streets in Ukraine, it's going to be worse, because I'm going to make it worse. if you go in the streets in Ukraine, I'm going to invade your country. I'm going to make it worse. There are no alternatives, right? This is the dark version of no alternatives. And so we have to be in a position to say, actually, there are lots of good alternatives, and we can see what some of those good alternatives are. We can't, it's not automatic, but we could actually get there, something like that.
Now, Tim, my final question, and thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And I know that Rory's going to roll his eyes madly when I ask this question and say, "You're obsessed, man." I want to ask you, what were the historical trends of which Brexit was a part, and what is history going to think of Brexit?
I mean, I think stupidity is an underused historical category. I mean, I think we underestimate both how brilliant we can be and how stupid we can be, and how conjunctures can arise in which we do things that are very foolish. For that debate, I was in Britain a few times. I came in and out. I wasn't living there at that time. I was looking at Brexit from a certain position, which was a person who was writing a book called Road to Unfreedom, which was about Russia invading Ukraine. It was about the 2010s and what was going wrong in the 2010s. And from that perspective, I see two things about Brexit, which may not seem essential to the British, but which I think were essential at the time. One is social media. I think Brexit is very much kind of in that general trough with Trump, where things that wouldn't have been possible a decade before were suddenly possible because social media had changed politics into much more of an us and them, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm angry sort of discussion deeply. And that at a more superficial level, social media enabled bad actors to change the conversation in ways that we were not really aware of at the time. But a huge amount of the social media traffic on Brexit, something like 10% on Twitter, came literally from just one other country, which happens to be Russia. And I deeply believe that changed the tone of the conversation. I think without social media, and perhaps even without just Russia in social media, that vote might have gone another way. So, my deep sentiment about Brexit is that the European Union is an interesting and promising form of post-imperial politics. So for me, the big question of the 21st century, or one of them, is what do you do after empire? Because empire, I mean, even if regardless of which side of empire you were on, there's a danger in the past. Right? There's a danger in if you're in a post-colonial position, of just being stuck and being opposed to the empires. And if you're in an imperial position, there's a danger in being nostalgic for empire. But where European countries have succeeded is in doing something different, which was European Union. European Union is a place to go after empire. That's how, by the way, if you look at the debates in Britain in the 60s, people were well aware of this 60 years ago. The EU is there as a place to go after empire. That's what it's for. And that's what it succeeds in. And so as a historian, which I guess is how you asked, my deep reaction to it was that the British are people voting for Brexit are misunderstanding post-imperial global politics, that they've been offered this thing to do after empire. That is a good thing to do after empire. Whereas being on your own or trying to be a nation state is a weaker alternative in every way than being with other European countries after empire. And that the European Union is a much more radical. It's an interesting new sort of thing to do. Whereas in Britain, it's kind of like, ever since I've been a political adult, it's been portrayed as boring, repressive, yada, yada, yada. Whereas in fact, it's kind of an interesting thing to do. Just going off and trying to be a nation state is pretty boring. Everybody does that. And, whereas the European Union is actually sort of interesting. So there you have my answer.
This has been fantastic to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks to both of you.